Welcome to this week's edition of the Pete Mezzetti Show. I'm Pete Mezzetti. My guest this evening is Betsy Garrow, who's the Executive Director of COST, which is the Connecticut Small Town of Government. Betsy, welcome. How are you?
Thank you, Pete. It's great to be here. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. It's been a while. Been a while,
almost a year.
I know, and I think I got the acronym right.
Close. It's the Connecticut Council of Small Towns, COST.
Don't tell Carl Fortuna I goofed that up because he'll beat me up.
I think I might.
Yeah. So Betsy, tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been Executive Director of COST.
Sure. Well, first I started lobbying for COST back in probably 2006, and then I became their Executive Director in 2012 when the current Executive Director ended up retiring.
Okay.
So it's been a really good fit for me. I live in a small town. I grew up in a small town, and I really do enjoy visiting all of our small towns throughout the state.
Right. And now, do you guys reach all 169 towns?
No, we don't. So there are 115 members of COST.
Okay.
They're towns with a population of 30,000 or less.
Okay.
And so they're a very active group, and we rely on them to reach out to their legislators, respond to alerts and calls for action, and just let them know how a proposed bill or regulation may impact their community, their tax base, their revenues, etc.
Right. Now, the Connecticut State Legislature recently convened in June. And that was a short session, right?
Well, there was a special session. So it had been a short session, but there were a few things that had just not been taken up that they really needed to act on. The one that COST was involved with had to do with how motor vehicles are assessed for purposes of property taxes. So the state has actually moved the way that they assess those motor vehicles.
Okay.
And unfortunately, there was an error in the legislation, and it would have resulted in businesses paying significantly higher taxes for their vehicles than they would have under the previous statute. So that needed to be corrected. And unfortunately, it got bogged down in the Senate during the regular session.
Okay.
The Senate amended it to require towns to phase out the property tax on cars.
All right.
The problem with that, no one loves the car tax,
no.
But the problem with that is that it generates over $1 billion in revenue for our towns.
Right.
And that's revenue that comes in locally that can be used to fund the delivery of critical local services. So we need that money.
Right.
Again, unfortunately, the bill to fix the motor vehicle assessments didn't pass during the regular session. So fortunately, they convened in special session at the end of June and corrected that. So we were happy about that.
And so now what does that mean? Did it obviously?
It means that
did it pass?
It passed. So next year there are some changes. So for example, and this gets into a little bit of the weeds.
That's okay.
Currently, cars are valued using the Blue Book value. So
Yes.
the values set by the National Automotive Dealers Association. Those fluctuate. So you remember during COVID, all of a sudden your used car was valued much higher.
Yeah.
And people were getting property tax bills and seeing huge increases, and they were upset.
Right.
Like, why did my car get a year older and yet I'm paying more in car taxes?
Right.
So what they've now done is move to the manufacturer's suggested retail price, and subject that to depreciation every year. So it's going to be a less volatile number that you're seeing, and so it'll control those spikes in property taxes on your car. So I think it's a good thing. It also frees up some of the time of the assessors so that they don't have to go out and figure out what the NADA values are every year.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure that's time consuming.
It is. So
now let's talk about housing policies.
Housing. So housing has been a huge issue at the state capitol for the last several years.
Okay.
And as you probably have heard, there's been a shortage of housing units, housing stock, and as a result, there's concern that, particularly relative to affordable housing, that we're not meeting the demand. And so there are advocacy organizations that are pushing for different approaches to address affordable housing. Some of them are quite controversial. So the governor just convened the Municipal Redevelopment Authority, and that was revamped a couple years ago to focus on working with communities that wanted to identify areas in their town that they consider housing growth zones.
Okay.
And so under this approach, it's really an opt-in. The towns can voluntarily opt in to work with MRDA, Municipal Redevelopment Authority, to say, you know what, we want to identify a housing growth zone. It's going to be part of a transit-oriented development project like you see in some of our communities. I know Old Saybrook has one.
Yeah.
And make sure that those transit-oriented development projects also include some affordable housing and other types of housing so that we can better meet the demand. So that's going to be interesting. They just convened their first meeting, even though they had been revamped a couple of years ago. But I think it's an interesting approach. I know that there's some funding available to assist communities that are interested in doing that. For small towns, however, they would have to band with other communities to do this. So we're going to be looking at that legislation and seeing if there are ways to make it more lucrative for small towns to participate. The other approach, so there's another group, Desegregate Connecticut, which is pushing for transit-oriented communities. It's sort of similar, but different. And the town, in order to opt into that program and get priority funding, would have to approve what they call as-of-right zoning for middle housing. So middle housing is those duplexes, three-family homes, cottage clusters, but short of the big multifamily dwelling units that you may be thinking about, are apartment houses. And so if they zoned as of right, and as of right simply means, I'm sure you know because you're active in local government, that you don't have to go through the special permit process or exception process.
Right.
As long as you comply with the town's zoning regulations, you can actually get approval, much like you do now for a one-family home. So the developer puts the site plan in for review, but as long as it conforms to the zoning requirements, you don't have to go through this whole separate process, which can be lengthy.
Right.
So that failed. It did pass the House by a fairly good margin, but it failed in the Senate. I know that they want to bring that proposal back. We had some concerns about it because it was giving priority for funding for one of our funding streams, a Small Town Economic Assistance Program, or STEEP grants. And we were concerned that because a lot of towns won't be eligible because they don't have a transit station or a rapid bus station, that they would get shut out of those funds. And the small town, that program was designed obviously to assist small towns in addressing some of their economic development needs. So that'll be back on the table. The bigger issue that's out there, and I think is going to be very controversial, is the fair share housing methodology. So under legislation adopted in 2023, the Office of Policy and Management had to retain a consultant to develop a methodology for determining what the housing needs are in a region. And then within that region, allocating every single town their fair share of affordable housing units that they have to meet. And there's a lot of questions about that. Like, what do you do if nobody wants to build there? What do you do if there's really no demand? If you're in an area where there's not a lot of job growth, it's very rural, how does that impact the community? And it's modeled after legislation adopted in New Jersey, which has been bogged down in litigation for years. So that group, they just hired the consultant. There was supposed to be an advisory committee, which Cost and CCM were participating on, and they abruptly said, you know what, we're not going to have an advisory committee. We may be reaching out to you, but at this point, we're just going to work with our consultant, develop the methodology. It will go back to the legislature next year, hopefully, and be able to be reviewed and have a subject to public hearing, but it could be very problematic, and it doesn't provide any type of recourse if a town doesn't have sufficient water infrastructure or sewer infrastructure, if it has a significant amount of watershed or wetlands. It doesn't account for that. There's nothing in the methodology or in the underlying legislation that says, you know what, you should consider these factors too. And that's troubling, because we have seen there's been a bit of a push between affordable housing advocates and environmental advocates, that they're trying to sidestep some of the watershed and wetlands reviews that are part of a town's responsibility. So that's a problem. So we're going to see those proposals next session. I'm bracing for it. I think it's going to be very controversial. We need input. I mean, that's the biggest thing. Is we are a grassroots advocacy organization. We rely on our members to give us the input, let us know how this would impact their community. And they've been very good about that, but we need to do more. We need to continue to meet with our legislators and let them know kind of how this thing may play out in their community. Because from a practical standpoint, when you talk to the first selectman or a planner in a community and you say, well, would this fit? And if they pass this type of legislation, how would it impact you? And they're very good at explaining some of the issues within their own community, and they're different from every community. Right. So it's been an interesting process for me to go through. I'm learning a lot about zoning and land use, which is always interesting.
Now, what exactly is a STEEP grant? I've heard the term, and...
So the Small Town Economic Assistance Program, it's towns with a population of less than 30,000 are eligible. There's also some wiggle room for some other communities.
Oh, okay.
But it provides grants, and they just changed this in the last legislative session. It provides grants of up to $1 million per town for a wide range of projects. So anything considered economic or community development, one of your local parks, a senior center, a community center, if you want to upgrade your main street. It really has a lot of flexibility to it, and that's what I think it's been so important. The federal government gives millions and millions of dollars, and the state gives millions of dollars to the Urban Act Fund, and that goes to cities to fund a wide range of economic development projects. But there hadn't been anything for the small towns, and so it has been an important tool to assist our towns in making their communities, improving the quality of life there, and addressing some of the infrastructure and economic development needs. So it's a good program.
Would you mind sticking around for another segment?
Oh, sure.
All right.
Be happy to.
We'll be right back.
I don't think that many kids in my son's school even do it.
He makes fun of his friend who vapes.
He would never try it.
She's into soccer.
She's on the honor roll.
She's just not the type.
No way.
No way.
No way.
No way, my kid would never vape.
Get your head out of the cloud. Today, nearly 8,000 kids will start vaping, maybe even yours. Learn about the dangers at talkaboutvaping.org.
For decades, I've taught you everything I know. How to safely build a fire, and how to control the flames. But I can only teach wildfire prevention. Only you can prevent wildfires.
On the whole stores.
All right,
there.
welcome back to this week's edition of the Pete Mezzetti Show. All right, let's start that over. Welcome back to this week's edition of the Pete Mezzetti Show. I'm Pete Mezzetti, sitting here with Betsy Garra from Cost. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me,
Thanks
Pete.
for sticking around. All right, so we talked about housing policies. You want to pick up this segment talking about solid waste management or workforce development?
Trash. Let's talk trash.
All right.
It sounds like a interesting topic, but it is a big issue for our small towns because the tipping fees for solid waste are going up and up, and unfortunately we're running out of places to put the stuff.
Right.
So as you know, the recycling authority in Hartford that served many areas of the state closed.
Was that Mira?
Mira,
Okay.
correct. And as a result, there are an over-reliance really in this state on shipping our waste out of state to Pennsylvania and other states.
Oh.
And the problem with that is, first of all, it's not environmentally sound,
No.
because a lot of times the trash will either, get discarded along
Right.
the road or in the waterways. And we really should take responsibility for managing our own solid waste. Unfortunately, the remaining trash to energy facilities that we have in this state really don't have that much additional capacity. There may be some additional capacity, but not enough to address the problem. So we're really desperate at this point to try to find some answers. So the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection has authorized the creation of regional waste authorities, and those proposals are now being developed, and a lot of the councils of government are working to do that with communities. I know that RiverCog, for example, is considering or moving ahead with a regional waste authority. The questions are, though, is really what are they going to be able to do? And I know we had a meeting recently with DEEP and some of the area legislators, and they were concerned that there isn't enough specificity in the legislation to say, what do these regional waste authorities do? What are their responsibilities, and how will their policies be enforced? So the other issue that they raise is, if you don't have capacity at any of these facilities, then what are you going to do? What are you going to do with this waste? That's the big issue.
Where does it go?
So hopefully there will be some efforts to permit new facilities, and then that brings in other issues. The permitting process is very lengthy. So how can we get some new technologies in place? And there are new technologies out there. I've heard different types of companies are coming up with innovative ways to handle solid waste, but they need to go through permitting. They need to get approved by the local government that they're going to be sited in. But I think there are some promising initiatives out there, but we need to move on this, and it tends to get bogged down. So every year there's a solid waste management bill, at least for the last couple of years, and it just gets picked apart and nothing ends up really happening. So I think we need to really focus on putting together a comprehensive proposal that can get passed by the legislature that will address the facility issue and make sure that towns can better manage their solid waste. It's a growing problem. So you see a lot of talk about EPR, extended producer responsibility programs. So like you could take your paint back to the hardware store, or a hazardous waste site. You're going to be able to take back your tires instead of having people discard their tires along the road or in rivers and streams. They're going to be able to take back your tires. That's legislation has been adopted, and they're waiting to finalize that program. And there's other EPR programs that they're thinking of doing. The one that's the most controversial is for packaging. So I know that DEEP has pushed for an EPR program for packaging, meaning any packaging that comes with your product, not just the cardboard boxes, but really any packaging. The
bubble wrap or whatever.
Right, the producer's going to have to be responsible for. And that one is much more controversial. So we're trying to survey our members and see where they are with that. The other way that some towns have tried to address it is the pay as you throw. So if you're throwing out a lot of waste, you're going to pay more. And very controversial. People have not liked that. So I don't know that that's going to get anywhere. The other way that they're trying to address it is because when they've looked at what is in our waste stream, a lot of the heavy materials are the organics, the food waste. So you think about it, you throw these leftover food out, produce, things of that nature, and it weighs a lot, and it's easily recycled because you can compost it. They have had pilot programs where they're encouraging people to compost these materials, and there's also organics recycling facilities, and so those are increasing. You'll see a few more of those throughout the state, and so that's a good thing. But all in all, we still need to look at our facilities and come up with some way to manage the solid waste responsibly and cost effectively. So that's a big challenge.
You think it can be done?
I think it can be done. I think we need to ensure that there's a statewide approach that identifies what the goals are, rather than, I feel like right now we have a solid waste management plan, they set goals, we haven't met those goals. They haven't provided any tools to really assist towns in meeting those goals. But I think if we permit new facilities to come in and try to deal with this issue, I think we could do it, and we have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what are some things that you guys want to see for the next legislative session?
Well, that's a good question. It's going to be a long session. We're going to have a few new legislators, not a lot of retirements this go around. So the first step is really just identifying the legislative proposals that are important. The top issue for towns is always municipal aid.
Yep.
How much money is the state going to give us to deliver these services? Education continues to be one of those issues that drives up the cost of your local taxes. And education costs keep rising and rising. So for a lot of towns, the cost of education could be 60, 70, even 80% of the local budget. And under the existing statute,
right,
you can't spend less than you spent the year before, except under certain circumstances. So if you consolidated a school, you closed a school, then you can reduce your spending. But other than that, you have to maintain that minimum budget level. And so that means that it's very difficult to control those costs. One of the costs that keeps going up as part of education is special education costs.
Yep.
And I noticed there was a report recently that indicated that Connecticut is actually outplacing a lot of its special education students, more so than any other state. So that's something that needs to be looked at. We also need to see whether there can be a way to regionalize some of these special education services so that you don't have parents feeling like they have to move to a new school district just to take advantage of those programs. We might want to make sure that all of our students' needs are met, and special education is a big part of that, but we need to be able to do it in a more consistent manner and provide towns with more predictability as to what those costs will be, because right now that just doesn't happen. So maintaining municipal aid is important. I think we've done a good job of supporting increases in the Town Aid Road program and in the local bridge program. So that's been very helpful, but maintaining those investments is key. One of the issues that was adopted last session gives the governor's office a little wiggle room to cut municipal aid if there is a budget deficit. And it's not very clear, it's not spelled out in the legislation, but it says that the executive branch has that authority to make cuts to the budget. And we are concerned that that could be used as I know it was proposed under Governor Malloy at one point to make mid-year cuts to municipal aid. That would be very problematic. So we're keeping a close eye on the state budget. Certainly we have had some record surpluses, but we also want to make sure that some of that money goes back to our towns so that the towns can keep their property taxes level and more affordable.
Now, you said that this session is the long session, so correct me if I'm wrong. Long session, January to June?
Yes,
I think. January to June. All right, I was right.
Yes, and the long session, it can be a lot of moving parts. So we maintain a full-time presence at the state capitol. We read every single bill, every amendment, and it's becoming increasingly difficult because every year there are more and more bills proposed. And it's unfortunate that we just had a conversation earlier today with somebody that a bill comes out, they have a public hearing, there's a short time frame for that committee to act on it.
Right.
And it could be something that if they had approached us in the fall or even a month before session, we could actually sit down and vet the legislation and try to figure out if there's any way to fix it or address the concerns. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen a lot.
Oh, no?
And so we're going to make sure that our municipalities meet with their legislative delegations to talk about the issues that they want to see addressed this session.
Wow, you guys are going to be very busy in the session.
Very busy, yes. It's always a very busy time, and it's busy in the fall when we begin developing our legislative recommendations for the upcoming session and reaching out to legislators to talk about those issues. So it's
Now,
always
what are some of the legislative things in the fall that you want to recommend for the upcoming session?
well, in addition to just maintaining or increasing where possible municipal aid, we certainly want to address the solid waste management issues. So I think that's going to be a big initiative. And relative to housing policy, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the housing issues and coming up with a proposal that our towns can support that addresses their concerns, but that also starts to move the dime on some of these affordable housing issues, because every year, again, it's just a real problem that you're hit with about 4 or 5 different massive proposals to address housing and landlord-tenant issues, and unfortunately, you just scramble to try to figure out what the impact of some of those is going to be, and then all of a sudden you see the bill is called at 10 o'clock at night, and you're reading a 1,000-page bill sometimes. So it's a lot of work. Some of the other issues, we're always looking at other environmental issues and addressing things like invasive species, which are problematic, and also looking at issues regarding bears. In one part of the state, bears is a big issue. There's actually a task force that's meeting now to address concerns regarding roaming cows and hogs, because there's apparently one town, the town of Sterling, where a farmer has let his hogs run wild, literally.
Oh, good.
And they've become feral, and they're tearing up people's lawns and becoming quite aggressive. So there's a task force to look at that issue. So there's always something out there.
Betsy Gara from CUS, we're about to run out of time, but before we do, I want to thank you for coming down. Hopefully we'll see you soon.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Betsy.
Thank
On behalf
you.
of Betsy Gara, I'm Pete Mezzetti. Thanks, good night, and we'll see you next time.